Okay, everyone, we're going to get started for our seminar today. Joining us as our speaker today is Wejdaan Faridi, and he's going to be talking to us about some residual force enhancement. Wejdaan did his undergraduate studies here at the University of Calgary in kinesiology, and his honors thesis looked at some kinetics of Titan domain unfolding, which I believe is what he's going to be speaking to us about today. Currently, he is a master's student in kinesiology working under Dr. Cindy Barha, and the topic of his research is exercise as a neuroprotective intervention against dementia in perimenopausal females. So a little bit of a change. And some of his personal interests are reading biographies, as well as he enjoys playing and coaching basketball. He's currently coaching an under 15 team. Okay, so Wejdaan, thanks.
Cool. All right. Am I audible? Is this good? All right, perfect. Just a quick disclaimer before I begin. I know it says Dr. Herzog's lab, as was mentioned before. I'm not currently in Dr. Herzog's lab, but for today and for this seminar, I'm very much so under Dr. Herzog's lab. Cool. Okay, let's get started. Before I can go into talking about what I did, I think it is important for us to take a moment and try and establish the relevant context for what we're going to be discussing. A lot of the work that I looked at was looking at the biomechanics of muscle and muscle physiology. So let's go over some of the main broader concepts of what we need to discuss. Muscle altogether is comprised first and foremost of smaller fascicles. And within these fascicles, you have a bunch of string-like cells called your muscle fibers, which is the structure that I actually worked with for my experimentation. Although that is what I worked with, I think it is still important for us to go farther than this and try and deconstruct, obviously, what muscle fibers themselves look like. So muscle fibers themselves are then again can be broken down into further strings of long strings of sarcomeres, which are called myofibrils. Sarcomere, which is the smallest functional independent unit of muscles, contain three main proteins of interest that I want to point out. I'm going to camp them in two different categories. The first of which are active proteins, and that includes the thick filament, in other words, myosin, and actin, which is the thin filament. The passive component includes titin, which is a long globular chain-like protein, as can be seen within the blue onto the slide. Within our current understanding of how muscles function and how the contraction within muscles work, in front of you is a current depiction of the cross-bridge cycle as we currently understand it in today's world. Actin and myosin are responsible for interacting with each other, and where the myosin heads attach to actin and produce a rowing-like or stroke-like motion to bring in the ends of the sarcomere together and produce force. What's important to note is that within a specific given length, there is a maximum amount of force that can be produced. The graph in front of you depicts the force-length relationship. The main thing that I want to outline here is that as we know that force is primarily produced by the interactions from actin and myosin, it would make sense that the mediating factor for how much force can be produced at any given length is the amount of overlap that exists between actin and myosin. Titin, on the other hand, has two main responsibilities from within physiologically relevant ranges from what we traditionally know. The first of which is that it's responsible for maintaining structural integrity. One of the reasons that myosin is capable of standing or staying within the center of the sarcomere is because of titin. The second thing, which is also important to note, is that it produces passive forces at very long lengths. These lengths are often beyond the physiologically relevant ranges, beyond what we ourselves as human might be able to stretch our muscles to. That is important to note because it will be relevant for the upcoming discussion. Now, let's go over what exactly residual force enhancement is and what it looks like. If we were to contract a muscle, and while it is contracting, stretch it, a type of stretch that we call an active stretch, you are able to produce a force that is visibly higher than if you took the exact same muscle and you stretched it without a contraction to the same final length and then isometrically contracted maximally there. It is this difference in force, this increase in force, that we term RFE, or residual force enhancement. Bringing back the force-length relationship, I want to briefly discuss why RFE in itself is so important and why we're so interested in RFE in the first place. As I mentioned, our current understanding of how the cross-bridge cycle works, and by extension, the maximum amount of force that ought to be produced at any given length, is shown by an maximum isometric contraction depicted in the blue. However, these active stretches are capable of producing forces outside of this relationship, and hence shows that our current understanding is missing something. There's something that is unable to give us an understanding as to where RFE is coming from and why it is being produced. So while we don't really know where RFE comes from, what we do know, and what researchers for the most part are in consensus of, is that RFE is comprised of two components that are both engaged in producing RFE. The first of which is the active, the second of which is the passive. Let's talk about what this might look like in the context of an active stretch. The active component might look like one of two things. The first is an active stretch may allow us to increase the number of cross bridges that can be recruited, and hence is able to produce greater forces. The second possibility is that the active stretch in itself, although it does not allow us to recruit more cross bridges, it has a change in conformation that may allow us to increase the amount of force that may be coming from each individual cross bridge. I know these are very crude representations, but I was hoping that they would try and aid some of your visual representation or understanding of what might be happening. Next is Titan. As I've already mentioned and outlined earlier, Titan is only shown to produce passive forces at long lengths beyond physiological working range. But you see RFE within physiological working range. So the question that many people would then have is, how is it possible for us to have passive forces within this physiological working range? So Dr. Herzog actually came up with a theory in which during activation, Titan is capable of interacting with actin and binding to actin. And in doing so, what you're able to do is reduce the spring of Titan and significantly increase the stiffness of the spring as well. So when you have this binding and then you have your active stretch following it, then you might be able to say that Titan is in fact capable of producing physiologically relevant work and hence contributing to RFE within this specific context. As it currently stands, we don't really know what the relative contributions of the active and the passive components to RFE is. So the question is, how can we try and explore this relative contribution? And more importantly, the question that we're trying to answer and trying to address is it possible for us to control for one of these components? Because in doing so, we might be able to isolate the effects of one over the other. This is where I introduce what we're interested in, Riger state or the Riger solutions. So let's quickly go back to what the cross-bridge theory in itself states about what happens during general contractions. When the myosin head interacts with actin, ATP is responsible for detaching that myosin head from actin. So what would happen if in a Riger solution where ATP is no longer available to these cross bridges? We think two things are likely to happen. The first of which is that all of the possible cross bridges are going to be attached. Note, I say that all possible because it is possible, it is likely that not every single one will be attached within this situation, but we think it's going to be more than what we currently see within the contracting muscle. The second thing is that we also think that they're going to be in a similar post-stroke conformation. And in doing so, we'll be able to somewhat control for the conformation of these cross bridges as well. By extension, then, we may be able to say that a Riger state will help normalize the contribution of the active component and hence isolate the passive component and its contribution to RFE. The purpose of our study then was to gain insight on the contribution of the passive element to RFE done by inducing a Riger state in purely isometric and actively stretched contractions in single muscle fibers. There are in total three things that I want to note in what we expected to happen within our hypotheses. But rather than just stating them, I wanted to provide a brief visual representation of what we thought that might look like. The first thing that we expected is an increase in force. If we induce a Riger state at any given moment after maximum contraction, one of the things we noted is that there's going to be an increase in the number of cross bridges that are being attached. So we think that by extension would also mean that there should be an increase in force. The second thing is that we also think that in Riger state, the RFE is going to be reduced. The reason we say this is, again, I think just a brief logical explanation of which would be if there's two components that are directly feeding into the production of RFE, once you normalize or control for one or get rid of one, it would make sense for the RFE in total to reduce following that protocol. Let's go over what we did. So as I initially pointed out, we worked with single muscle fibers that were isolated from New Zealand white rabbits. Each of them went through two different contractions, a reference contraction as well as an active stretch contraction. The apparatus we use, for many of those who might not be currently aware, requires you to isolate a fiber and place it on two hooks. On one side, you have a force transducer that can help you track the force throughout the entire protocol. On the other side, you have a length controller that can help you make very fine adjustments to the length of this fiber over the duration of the protocol. The way by which we are able to selectively activate, relax, and then induce a Riger state as well is by submerging these fibers within solutions. These solutions then would have the necessary compounds to either activate it, for example, calcium and ATP, to relax it, which would require only ATP without calcium, and then a Riger state in which you do not have ATP. And then this is just a visual representation of how we move the fiber from one bath to another throughout the protocol. Let's briefly go over trying to explain the contractions and try to keep specific note of how the force changes over time, since this will help you try and understand what's going on when I reveal the actual results as well. So for the reference contraction, we started off with an average sarcomere length of 2.4, and we passively stretched it to 3.0 microns. At this point, we activated the fiber by putting it in an activating solution. And last but not least, we submerged it in Riger for a grand total of 90 seconds. For the active stretch contraction, we started with a fiber that was at 2.4, but before we stretched it, we activated it. Then while it was activating, or while it was contracting, sorry, we then stretched it and produced an active stretch to 3.0. And last but not least, we submerged it in Riger for a grand total of 90 seconds. What were the things we looked for, the outcome measures that we followed? Firstly, we looked at the RFE within the activating solution and Riger solution. Just note that this will be referred to RFE ATP and RFE Riger respectively. We also looked at stiffness and how stiffness changed. We first took the stiffness measurement right before we submerged it within the Riger solution, and then also after the 90 seconds that it was submerged within the Riger solution. For quick context, a stiffness test is a very quick and short stretch that is done on the fiber. And it is done in order to try and identify the number of cross bridges. The logic goes somewhat as follows. The resistance that you feel when you do a very quick and small stretch within a fiber will primarily be dictated by the number of cross bridges. So a greater stiffness measurement will then mean that you have more cross bridges attached in that moment of time. So what did we find? Before I go on, just a quick note, there is something that we didn't see thus far. If we look at, there's huge spikes within the force as we see throughout the protocol. Just note that that's a lot of noise that comes from moving the fiber from one bat to the other. So try to avoid that or disregard that for the most part. Cool. So our results were quite interesting and very shocking to say the least. First and foremost, we initially said that we thought the RFE should have decreased. Instead of decreasing, the RFE actually doubled from an approximate percentage of 8.5 to 17.2%. We also saw the stiffness, two things to note with the stiffness. Firstly, when we're comparing the stiffness between actively stretched and isometrically contracted muscles, whether you're looking at them within the activating solution before Riger submersion or while they're in Riger submersion, there is no statistical significance between the two. However, if you were to compare the two stiffnesses before submersion in Riger, however, after submersion in Riger, we do see a statistically significant increase in both these isometrically contracted and the actively stretched muscles. The first thing that was quite odd and contrary to what we initially said was that the force decreased instead of increasing as we initially said. There are two things to note, however. Firstly, this was very consistent with every single experiment that we did, is that the force increased slightly in the beginning before we saw a gradual decrease in the Riger solution. The second thing we noted as well is that the stiffness did in fact increase. And as I mentioned, that does aid to our initial explanation that the number of cross bridges are increasing following submersion in Riger. So I think we have enough evidence to then conclude that the number of cross bridges increased. What then can we say for the reasons as to why the reasons as to why the overall force decreased within its time in Riger solution? I'm going to propose two possible mechanisms here. The first of which is that it is possible that there's some type of change in conformation that we don't yet understand or have any knowledge of, haven't really looked into, because Riger solutions haven't been that well studied in that regard. And that change in conformation changes the amount of overall force generated per cross bridge. So while the number of cross bridges increase, the force per cross bridges decreases, and that decrease is greater than what any type of benefit that you might gain from the number of cross bridges, leading to an overall decline in force. The second possibility is that while the number of cross bridges increased, we think that the force given per cross bridge decreased gradually over time because the true nature of these cross bridges are viscoelastic instead of purely elastic, as the cross bridge theory might initially propose or suggest. The second thing we saw is that the RFE increased. Now, this is, if we do assume that our initial understanding of the situation is correct, that Riger states do in fact allow us to control for the contribution of the active component, only then can we say that the increase in RFE is primarily dictated by Titan or the passive element, which means that Riger states must, in that scenario, increase Titan stiffness or increase the contribution of Titan to RFE within Riger solution. Going back to our initial question then, what is the relative contribution of each to RFE, of both the active and the passive component? Assuming that the active component was in fact the same between the reference and RFE contraction, then we may be able to say that the overall increase in RFE does in fact come from an increase in Titan stiffness. However, there are some major limitations to note within this experiment. The first is that there's no way to test directly whether or not the assumption is true. It's very possible that Riger's solution in itself is in fact changing the way that our active components are interacting with each other, whether it's via conformation, whether it might be via the number of cross bridges that are happening as well. And so between the actively stretched and the isometrically stretched, there is a difference that carries forth even into Riger's solution. The second is that there's not enough stiffness measurements that were made as well. There's a gradual decline in force. We only did a stiffness measurement at the end of the experiment. So it may be possible that that stiffness was greater when you first put it within the Riger solution, and it tapered off while the force decreased over time. The third thing to note is that the reduction of force may be coming from passive element. This is a major, I guess, argument that has been put forth when we've presented this in other places as well, that while the force is declining, it also may be coming from the fact that it may be coming from the relaxation of the passive elements, because the passive elements, as we know, are indeed viscoelastic. And the biggest thing to note at the end of the day is that this type of experiment did ultimately leave more questions unanswered than it did answer questions. But I still think that there's a silver lining here, and that is it outlines something that we didn't initially know, and opens up a number of doors for us to now explore and try and better understand the mechanisms behind muscle contraction and the development of RFE. What are some of the things we think we could have done moving forward? The first is obviously ensuring that we do far more frequent stiffness tests. Note that we did do the experiments here. If anyone is interested in seeing what the results were, I can briefly go over them within the question and answer period. The slides are at the end of the PowerPoint. We wanted to try and make the overall message clear. We can complicate it later if we need to. The second thing is that, does the conformation of these cross bridges change in the Riger solution? One way we might be able to explore this is via X-ray diffraction. Unfortunately, X-ray diffraction does not allow us to look into conformational changes or structural changes with Titan more directly, but at the very least, we might be able to see whether the Riger solution in itself is lending to, or the active stretch is lending to conformational changes with the cross bridges. The third thing that we might be able to look into is whether or not it would be possible instead to control for the active component to control for the passive component. This in comparison may be done far more directly by trying to use proteins that will help us delete or cut off certain segments of Titan and hence render it useless for the duration of the protocol. And last but not least is, can we gain insight through some of the energetics? This is some of the work that is being done by I believe Tori, if I'm not mistaken, within her master's thesis. So within the near future, we might be able to see more on RFE and some of the energetics involved behind it. At this point, I would like to first thank all of the people that made this work possible. I have bolded Dr. Juma's name because she's been very, very helpful in making sure and helping me put all of this together within a very short time frame. And without her, it would not have been possible. At this point, I'd love to take questions. And if you'd like to see some of the extra experimentation, I would love to show that as well.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And I'd also just like to thank you. You said you had a short time frame. We had another cancellation, so Wejdaan was nice enough to kind of last second bring a talk together. Any questions? Let's start this off. Yeah, Darsh?
Nice presentation. So if I understood it correctly, did you say that the stiffness increased the RFE?
No, so let me clarify, okay? So the stiffness is a measurement to try and understand how many cross bridges are currently attached within a given time frame. The stiffness following submersion in Riger increased. We don't think that necessarily lends to direct explanation for why the RFE increased, but at the very least, it gives us some amount of confidence that our initial understanding of how Riger solutions would change the overall cross bridges, in that it would increase the number of cross bridges that are attached at a given time. It does lend more confidence to those initial hypotheses, but doesn't give as much direction over what might be happening or leading to the increase in RFE in Riger solution.
So from my understanding, the stiffness is directly related to the passive elements of the muscle. Is it right?
It's directly related to the active elements of the muscle. So I do have a quick, I guess I could go over this because I have a slide for it, but all right, cool. So this is just a general representation I quickly put together of what's kind of happening during a stiffness test. When you have a quick or short little stretch, most of the change in force that you're seeing is coming from the red or the active elements, the cross bridges that are currently attached that are resisting that quick movement that you're placing on the muscle fiber. There is some amount that may be coming from Titan, but as you can see, it takes a far greater stretch for us to be able to see more tangible or measurable increases within Titan or the passive element. So more directly, the stiffness measurements are giving a sense of the of the active component and how many cross bridges we have at any given time. I hope that clears it up. If it's not clear, feel free to let me know.
So on those graphs where you had the time course ones, those little blips are the stiffness ones. So it's like a really short change in length.
Yes.
And so then it's like at approximately same path of course, because it's like approximately like very close in length.
Yeah, exactly.
Any other questions?
So at the end, do we know that this phenomena is like it's related to the active or passive? I didn't actually understand. Is it like merely passive or active, or is it both?
So from our current understanding of RFE, we can say that there is contribution by both elements. It's unclear how much each contributes to RFE. So it may be possible that RFE is primarily coming from the passive element. It may also be possible that RFE is primarily coming from the active elements. So the goal of this entire experiment was to try and see if we can outline what those relative contributions might be. Is it coming more from passive or more from the active? We were hoping that Riger would help us control for one, and hence the remaining RFE would be a representation of what the passive element is contributing, but it didn't work out that way since RFE increased. So truth be told, we're not entirely sure what happened in Riger solution.
Other questions? Venus?
Follow up on this. So at the end, you still said that assuming that the active contribution is the same, let's assume that the active contribution is the same. What is the origin of the increase in residual force enhancement?
At that point, you'd have to say that the origin is from Titan and Titan stiffness increasing within the Riger solution. It's unclear if that is happening, why that's happening within a Riger solution, because from the current understanding, we do know that calcium would increase the Titan stiffness, but calcium was already present at a maximum capacity within the activating solution before it entered Riger. So it's unclear what exactly changed and what led to that increase in stiffness, assuming again that the active component was controlled.
You know that the increase in Titan stiffness is also force dependent. So it's not just calcium dependent, it's force dependent. If you increase the amount of force produced by the metal, somehow the Titan stiffness, maybe it's in reaction with actin, also increases.
Yes, if I'm not mistaken, there's also a paper that suggests that the number of cross bridges is also correlated with Titan stiffness. So in the Riger solution, one potential explanation may then be that as the number of cross bridges increases, the overall stiffness of Titan increases as well, because it is a correlate that helps us identify how stiff Titan may be at any given time.
Can we go to the result where you show where you have the reference fiber and the fiber going into Riger?
Is it?
Is that one? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
So, you know, one suggestion that you make why you have that decrease in force could be the passive force.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, maybe I'm not seeing this right, but if I look, before you go into the Riger solution, in the blue trace especially, but also in the orange trace, the decrease in force doesn't seem to be as much as right afterwards. And if this was all passive force, then I would expect that kind of the blue and the orange trace would follow each other more. So that's why I'm a little bit skeptical that this might be passive force that's increasing.
Mm-hmm.
So then if it's, let's assume for the moment that that was correct, and not passive force that decreases so fast. And you know, I was thinking, not thinking about anything fancy, but just the cross-bridge theory. So if you go into a Riger solution and we assume more cross bridges attached, which seems to be supported by the increase in stiffness. But at the same time, we assume that force is lower, which it seems to be, at least at the end there, then purely based on the cross-bridge theory, that would mean, as you said, that you have less force per cross-bridge. And then you mentioned that maybe you go into a different state. But when fibers or when a cross-bridge is in Riger, it seems to be staying at the same stage. So maybe, and I haven't seen these results in a long time, and I haven't thought about it, but maybe what could be happening is that when you're in Riger and you exert a bit of force, that actin and myosin slide relative to one another, and so that distance, between what we call equilibrium state of the cross-bridge and where it attaches becomes smaller, and then force per cross-bridge would become smaller, even though cross-bridge stage might be the same. And maybe that doesn't happen in the isometric contraction, because in the isometric contraction you might get a little bit a shift of actin and myosin relative to one another as well. But then it detaches, attaches, and sometimes more are attached, and sometimes less are attached. So kind of actin and myosin go back and forth relative to another. But since the probability of cross-bridge attachment is higher at greater forces, that means when the equilibrium to attachment distance is large, maybe when you have a continuous turnover, you tend to have that bigger distance, and therefore stretch your cross-bridge elasticity more compared to after Riger, where it's stuck. You get that shift, and it never detaches and reattaches again. So maybe that's, I'm not sure if that makes sense, but if you want way of thinking about it.
I'll have to sit with it, if I'm being honest with you. There's a lot of moving parts. And realistically, there are many different ways you could try and go about to try and explain these things as well, especially because at the level of the fiber itself, we're not getting something as clean as everything necessarily as everything would be in the exact same post-stroke conformation, especially if we say that there's already some at the end of their strokes. For the newer cross bridges that are being attached, it's unclear whether or not they'd be able to go through the entire motion and actually pull in any farther, because you already are getting resistance from the previously attached post-stroke conformation cross bridges. So there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of things to consider. But thank you, Walter. This does give a lot of food for thought.
Yeah, you know, I got to know that the other thing is, why do we get more force enhancement? You know, you mentioned one possibility that Titan gets stiffer. You know, we also know that the Titan is working as a sensory organ, and it changes the number of cross bridges that are willing to attach what people call the off state or the on state. And it seems that we don't have the same number of in the on state compared to the off state. And I'm just wondering if potentially there might be a greater possibility for cross bridges to attach after you have done the stretch when you go into the rider. But it's not quite supported, because then your stiffness measurement should be different as well.
Yeah.
So, and then the other thing I was thinking is that I think you tested that with the different stiffness measurement across the time, because one thing was that the decrease in force there in Riger might be due to cross-bridge detachment rather than viscoelasticity.
Yes.
But the stiffness stays about the same, doesn't it?
For the most part. So if you want, I can quickly go to the slide and go
there
over the correlation values that we ended up getting as well. Yeah, this was the one. The one on the top, the correlation value on the top, the 0.5, is the correlation between the changes in stiffness to the changes in force within the isometric contraction. The one underneath is for the active stretch. So to some extent, we might be able to explain it, but it's not consistent between isometrically contracted and actively stretched fibers.
Can you show just the stiffness measurement as a function of time there? You had a graph there.
That
one, yeah.
This one, yes. This is for the active stretched muscles. These were this statistical analysis was done using ANOVA and with the Bonferroni correction. So there is the fact that there is a statistical difference is actually a big deal. It's because the Bonferroni correction is very conservative in trying to find differences between samples. So it is interesting to see that we're able to get these types of differences despite the fact that the values are so similar to each other. So the overall trend in itself is fairly consistent, in which you have a bit of an increase in the first few measurements and then a gradual decrease, but you only see that decrease when you compare it to those values at the end of the rider.
That's interesting, because if I saw it correctly, right, when you go into rider, your force initially increases.
Yeah.
And then it decreases. So if you assume for the moment that you have the maximum cross bridges attached there at S3, and that's when force is still higher, and now you gradually have that loss in force.
Mm-hmm.
If you took the difference in stiffness between S3 and S12 and calculated what the percentage difference of that is, and then you assume, let's say it's 20% difference, then you could say, well, purely according to cross-bridge theory, then force should go down by 20% as well. Did you ever try to correlate that?
No, I haven't. That's definitely a good thing to try. I'm gonna look into that.
And maybe that's the explanation then would suggest that you gradually have a slow detachment of the cross bridges, despite the fact that you're in Riger and they shouldn't really detach, but we don't really know if they actually do not detach in reality.
Yeah.
And, that might give you a hint about that. Maybe.
Purely just looking at the values, I would say that the overall decrease in force as a percentage is still probably greater than the decrease in stiffness, since the numbers themselves or the average numbers were quite similar to each other.
And I agree. I mean, it doesn't seem very much, whereas the force decrease seems quite a bit. So you're probably right. Something to look at maybe.
Any other questions?
And so for the stiffness again, I have this question. That you said that it is related to it might be related to the cross bridges that are already attached.
Yes.
Is it correct?
Yeah.
So if that is correct, why would we say that this is related to the active part of the contraction? Yes, it is the cross bridges that are attached, but we are not. We don't have any like new cross bridges. It's the already cross bridges that are already attached, and that stiffness increase is contributed to those.
Yes. So I do agree with you. Exactly. That's probably the explanation that we would give for the initial increase that we're seeing in the first couple of stiffness measurements. That as this force is going up within the first short moment, once you put it in Riger solution, so too are the number of cross bridges and hence the stiffness measurement. The more interesting part, or the part that we're confused about then subsequently after, is why there's such a gradual and noticeable decrease in force that doesn't seem to be directly correlated with the decrease in stiffness, which means that that's probably coming from somewhere else. And that's, I guess, where the question, I guess, we're trying to answer moving forward.
So if it is passive force that you suggested, then have you ever tried to just stretch to 3 microns and then let it sit there for 90 seconds, I guess it was, and just see what the passive force does alone, and if that might account for what you see in the enhanced state in the Rager solution there?
Yeah, so rather than stretching and then keeping this or holding the stretch for that long, what we have done is done the active stretch or done the stretch and then activated it and let it sit for 90 seconds without putting it in Riger. From what we have seen from the brief amount of testing we have done is that for the most part, the force stays relatively stable. So it seems to be that there is something changing with the introduction of the Riger solution. It's unclear what. The one thing we could try is simply stretching, and as it's relaxing, is put it into Riger solution without any activating previously to see if we might be able to then notice any change in the way that the force decreases subsequently after. The issue is you can't really isolate the passive relaxation there, because when you put it in Riger, then you will be able to get some cross bridges that would be attaching. So
what about doing the experiment below where you get passive force? So instead stretch from 2.4 to 3, you stretch from, I don't know, 1.8 to 2.4, and you have no or negligible passive force. You get rid of that confounding factor.
Yes, so we did do that. What we found was RFE in total before we put it into Riger solution, as well as in Riger solution, was lower. But if we were to compare how RFE changes before submersion in Riger solution and after submersion in Riger solution, with our initial testing done at 3.0 microns, we had about a doubling where the RFE doubled from 10.2 to 20.5.
So explain to me what you actually show there. So A to P and the Riger is clear, but what is the red and yellow?
The red is when we did our initial experimentation from 2.4 to 3.0 microns, that stretch. The yellow is when we went from 1.8 to 2.4.
Okay.
Yeah. And we saw that while overall RFE was lower, when we look at the relative values, you have almost a 4x increase in RFE in Riger solution, or in our Riger solution in comparison to activating solution.
So the amount in percentage much bigger, but in absolute values, it's about 10 units, 10%. Oh, it's in percent.
Yeah, it's in percent.
Okay, so sorry, I can't say anything about the absolute value. So you have the same phenomenon,
Yeah,
except even more exaggerated.
yeah, which is interesting.
And when you do it at 2.4 and you put it in Riger, you still get a relatively quick force decrease.
Yes. So this one is from putting it in Riger when it's at 2.4 microns and then placing it in, or sorry, activating it at 2.4 and then placing it in Riger subsequently.
And at 2.4, you don't have passive force.
We have much less passive force, but there still is passive force. So it's hard to completely eliminate passive force in that situation. But in comparison to at 3.0, we have much lower value.
You seem to have some passive force enhancement when you deactivate
Yeah. Yeah, like right here.
Passive force at the end seems to be higher than the passive force
Yes.
at the beginning, which you would expect when you have residual force enhancement. Even at 2.4, that's very interesting, actually.
Other questions? Wejdaan, did you have a question? Yeah, Venus.
I feel like discussing with Wejdaan about comparing stiffness, the highest stiffness to the stiffness at the end.
Yes.
But at the end, there might be like 90 seconds is a very long time. So there might be some cross bridges that are getting tired. There might be some, I don't know, structural damage across bridges of detaching, something like that. But I think the phenomenon of the decreased relaxation is happening. Like even if you take half time, like maybe 45 seconds, you can still see the relaxation, but I'm not sure about the stiffness. Did you compare it with the stiffness in the middle?
In the middle,
like, there's a force and stiffness.
what I did do is I looked at
S3 and S7.
yeah, so what this shows right here is this is showing the changes in force between each given measurement point. So between the force at the first stiffness measurement versus the second stiffness measurement, and giving the interval changes at every single step. And on the right-hand side, you have the changes in stiffness. The one thing that I would be able to say from this is that there's no clear correlation between the two, while there's a very clear consistent decrease happening within the force over time, although the magnitude of that decrease is tapering off and reducing over time. The stiffness is a bit all over the place. It changes in the beginning. It is both increasing and decreasing. It seems to be within the middle. And then at the end is when you see a very clear picture of it reducing.
So this S7, S8 compared to the maximal stiffness?
No, so this one is just between S7 and S8. So if you were to specifically look at this change in stiffness within the S7, S8 values, within both the blue being the isometrically contracted and the yellow being the actively stretched fibers, you had a decrease between those two specific time points in stiffness. Yeah, I just think this just helps visualize over time how things are changing rather than comparing it to one reference point, but looking at the interval changes.
So, were you done? So, how can you guarantee that when you are taking out this specimen from out of this bath and then like again submerging into another bath, the like in the bigger bath, how do you guarantee that the regulatory protein doesn't like changes, like the structure change? because you know the calcium is directly functioning on the tropomyosin and troponin C, and when you are like taking it out and again submerging it, it would actually cause those like structure of the tropomyosin and troponin to change. So how do you guarantee that it will not change?
There's no direct guarantee. I guess there is. We could say that when we do our testing, for the most part, even after we change bats, if you go from, for the most part, we have quite consistent and stable productions of force, which does lend to at least some extent for us to say that there is some consistency. When you're changing bats, you can very much so carry some of the previous solution on the fiber as you go into the next bath. It's something that's hard to control for. It's unclear how much it would impact the experiment, but it could have some amount of impact. But I reckon it would be small. However, I don't think you could argue for the fact that it would be large, since at most it would be a drop or two that you're carrying forth on the fiber. Yes.
And just like to follow up on that, like it would have pretty close to the same impact on all the fibers, right? So it wouldn't necessarily like impact the results because it would be pretty consistent across all your samples, right?
Yep. Yeah.
And I believe those experiments were done in Riker, activating Riker,
Yes.
but also relaxing Riker. There was no effect of changing, of having even having cancer or in the absence of cancer.
Yes, that reminds me. We did in fact try different solutions that different Riger solutions, sorry, that had calcium and others that didn't have calcium, and the overall trend stayed the same regardless. So I don't think calcium itself necessarily would have an impact. Is it possible something else might? Unsure, but at least at this point we don't have much evidence for it.
Another question, Walter?
You mentioned that in the future you'd like to do Titan deletion experiments. Why? What would you expect?
I would expect there to be RFE remaining, but I think that might give you a more direct measure of the contribution of the active component, quote unquote, and then from there you might be able to extend on what the relative contribution of Titan may be. So I don't, from my personal belief and from the reading that I've done, I would say that I'm inclined to say that Titan is likely more directly involved with the production of RFE. So I think while RFE would be visible in said experiments, I think it would be far lower than it would have been otherwise.
I was just more thinking about, you know, how much of Titan we need, because when you delete all Titan, there's no passive and no active force anymore. Well,
yeah,
there might be some passive force from some holding fiber, but there will be no active force anymore. There doesn't seem to be a possibility to transfer force without Titan.
Sorry,
when you delete all of Titan,
yeah,
there's no passive and no active force anymore in a skin fiber or in a myofiber.
Yes. I haven't looked too much into it. I'm not too sure exactly how we'd be able to do it. I did see a paper that was published like at the end of last year, I think. I think they used mouse models and then were able to change either it was Titan isoforms or try and actually delete parts of Titan via a mouse model and then isolate fibers from there. If I'm not mistaken, within that paper, they were able to find lower values of RFE, but were still able to see RFE. Within our single fiber preparations, I'd have to do a lot more looking into it to see if it would be possible and how we might be able to do that.
You can do partial Titan deletion, but you cannot delete everything. That's why I was wondering, like, what were you thinking? Are you deleting 20%, 50%? And then what would you expect to see that helps you with this problem?
I would hope to see that one thing we could possibly try is delete increasing amounts of Titan, and in doing so, we might be able to see increasing drops or lower levels of RFE as we continue on. That would at the very least give a lot of confidence to our understanding that Titan is a primary contributor to RFE. Granted that over time, as you try and delete more and more titin, you are consistently seeing drops in RFE. I'm not sure if that is what you would end up seeing, but it's something I'd hope you'd end up seeing.
Any other questions? Yeah, Walter.
Yeah, we need to talk about viscoelastic cross bridges.
Yeah, you want me to more? Sorry.
You know, for 80 years now, everybody has ever used the cross bridge model, so that cross bridges are elastic. So if you can prove that that decrease in force is not from breaking cross bridges, is not from a configurational change, but it's purely due to the viscous nature of cross bridges, then you have a nature paper. So you need to convince me now that you have a nature paper, because you're going to change the history of cross bridge models for the past 80 years.
I can't convince you of that quite yet. Hopefully one day I'll be able to convince you.
I mean, more serious, do you think there might be a way of testing what and how much viscoelasticity there might be in a cross bridge? Is an approach like that? Or how would you do that?
I think you're quite limited with these types of approaches because there's so many moving elements that are hard to directly control for. I'd have to think on it. I can't give you a direct answer right now. But at the very least, I think one thing that most people would have confidence in saying is that any biological material, for the most part, is ultimately viscoelastic to some extent. I guess the question would be, to what extent are cross bridges viscoelastic, and whether they're close to being purely elastic, or if we can give more evidence to say that it's not how we initially thought them to be.
Yeah, and you're correct. No, you're correct. There's nothing that I know that is purely elastic. All the quartz supposedly is like 0.99999 and 100 elastic. But Brent has a comment here.
Of the question, because I think I'm missing it, that it's probably obvious to the muscle people, but not to me. Why is it hard to do a viscoelastic test on a myofibril setup? Does it have something to do with keeping the fiber activated or something over time?
So when you're activating a muscle, you're constantly cycling through cross bridges that are attaching and detaching. So within that setup, it's very hard for us to isolate the effects of each, like one specific cross bridge, for example. In a Riger solution, again, theoretically you can, but then ideally you'd want to try and do it in the absence of passive elements, so that the option of you defaulting to saying that it's passive elements is not there. Like you have to conclude under said circumstances that that decline in force is coming from the fact that you have these cross bridges that are stuck. So with ATP and activating solution, you always have cycling, so you have to control for that order.
So I'm just thinking about laser trap experiments where people have a single cross bridge interacting with actin myosin at very, very, very low ATP levels. And there they can keep cross bridges attached, not for super long, but for several seconds at very low ATP concentrations. Just looking at their graphs, I mean, there's always Brownian noise there from the actin moving relative to the myosin, but you know, overall, if you drew a line through that noise, it would be pretty flat, you know, suggesting that there's not really much of a relaxation, at least on the level of a few seconds in a cross bridge.
I don't know. I can't. I mean, it's definitely interesting to weigh that up against what about obviously these types of experiments that are being done in more complete or complicated structures like a muscle fiber. Whether there, I don't have any reason right now to say, granted the lack of evidence, that if we can say that in these isolated preparations that there is these pure elasticity, that it would change in a whole muscle cell, but the possibility still does technically exist.
Just to follow up on that, like
Yes.
you said, that most biological tissues we know like have viscosity. Like at the whole muscle level, we think a lot of that is due to fluid, like muscle is largely water, so that's contributing. At the level of the cross bridge, like what do you think the source of that viscosity would be? If like the fluid at the whole muscle level is not in play.
I'm not too sure. I can't give you a direct answer right now. I think I'd have to probably do a lot more reading before I have a good idea there.
So I have a comment. So this will respond to your question. The structure of the myosin, I think, is a chain of different proteins. And these different proteins are connected to each other with covalent connection, I think, something like that. And this would cause the viscous property of the cross bridges. But I'm not sure. It's something that I think of.
How does having the covalent, could you explain the covalent bonds relating to the viscosity?
So you see the how can I explain that? So the when you have a covalent connection between two molecules, you are sharing. I think again, I'm not sure. You are sharing electrons, and maybe through the polarization of this, you are actually making a viscous phenomena. But again, I should think about that.
The way I see it is, in addition to covalent bonds, the way I see it, electrostatic interaction. So like the cross bridge is like this, and then when it rotates, it becomes like this. So then here, the electrostatic interaction are different than when it was like here. And so this would trigger a series of reaction because maybe minus is getting close to another minus in the head. And so this triggers a series of adaptations in order to make this happy again. So because a protein is full of charges in and there, so they will not be happy. Like you get two not happy close together, and so they would adapt the structure in order to become happy and change the course, and thus change the course.
Other questions for Wejdaan? Yeah. All right, let's thank him again.